Many years ago, I mentioned the fact to Werner that I was editing a collection of Raymond Williams's writings on Wales, to which he very kindly wrote the blurb on the back of the first edition. But Werner's response was, "I love Raymond Williams." So in a sense, it's on the basis of that that I invited Professor Sollors to join us today. And I asked him to think perhaps of his own life trajectory from the German New Left to American ethnicity. And I thought we'd have an opportunity to trace that together over the next 45 minutes or so. So Werner, I wonder whether we could just begin with your first encounter with Raymond Williams, but also in relation to your own thinking, your own intellectual formation.
Well, I mean, the first thing, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me. I wish I were literally in Swansea, because as you know, I have a very warm relationship to Wales. One of my very first trips outside Germany was to spend 3 weeks in an English grammar school, which was in Wirral, and the mother of the host family actually was Welsh, and so we did very frequent trips to Llangollen. I went to an Eisteddfod there, I never forget, and there were still women doing piecework that went on the canals to Liverpool, so it hadn't completely stopped the Industrial Revolution that Raymond Williams traced so nicely. And because I just heard a little bit of Harald's talk, I just wanted to say, as a sort of, whatever I am, an exiled German or a German who doesn't spend that much time in Germany these days, there were 2 moments in German post-war history where I really felt proud of a chancellor. And one was, "Wir schaffen das," the phrase that is so sentimental and yet so short. And the earlier one was Willy Brandt kneeling in Warsaw at the ghetto, which was wordless, but it was a gesture that, of course, no chancellor prior to Brandt or afterwards was ever able to match. So these were 2 very high moments. Well, I think for the question about how Williams affected me, I think one thing I want to say right away is he is such a clear writer. That is, something when you're a student and you're reading theoretical texts. I grew up in Frankfurt, so Frankfurt school reading was something that already occurred in high school. And I always liked Horkheimer, whom I understood. And Adorno, I always had to sort of wait for the verb and reconstruct, or then reading him in written form was a little bit easier. But with Raymond Williams, you don't have the problem of a language that obfuscates the argument that he's trying to make. So there's a clear body that he constructs in writing, and that makes also the text, Culture and Society and A Country in the City, teachable, so that you have quite a few passages that you can also, as single aphorisms, just hold out, and you get a feeling of some real meaning that is transported in single sentences. So he cared about the sentence. He's really also deeply shaped by the literature that he uses to analyze the historical processes. That was also so unusual to, start, on a process that begins with Burke and, takes you through to Matthew Arnold and a little bit afterwards. Basically, all the high literary figures on opposing camps in order to draw up a social history of how concepts emerge. And I think that's the second part of it that you already feel in his early work, and that really came to full fruition with what was meant to be an appendix, the keywords, where you just have a semantic distillation of important terms that we usually use around like coins, where we don't actually have a precise feeling about who coined that. He is very precise about how terms originate. So the conceptual clarity as well as the writerly clarity. But what was the answer that one was looking for then? And I think there, I do want to say a little bit about the context of the post-war German world. There was a real post-fascist exhaustion of anything that sounded like Volksgemeinschaft, or just even the term folk had already a very sinister meaning to it. Also, what Hal just mentioned, the question of an anthem. I was so happy when I was in England and everybody walked out of the movie theater before the credits came. I asked my friend, why is everybody leaving? He said, because the national anthem comes and you have to stand up. So everybody got out. And I thought it was such a perfect way of having a public ritual, at the same time creating an easy way out of the public ritual by charging to the exit the moment the end would appear on the screen. The sense of having, maybe I'll tell another little anecdote. I always went to these art movie theaters in Berlin, and they used to run these short features first. They got a tax credit if they did that. And once there was a short feature about the people of the bees. And so it was a beehive, and it said the bees recognize each other by the Volkseigener Geruch. And everybody in Berlin was roaring with laughter that there was, the East German term for an establishment owned by the people was Volkseigener Betrieb, VEB. So there was also a stink that came from the people themselves. So I think these kinds of ironic relations to folk were very strong. And on the other hand, you were looking for intellectual ways to deal with the whole fascist mess of the past, with the Cold War that was in full swing. When I came to Berlin, the wall was so fresh that you could still ring the doorbells at Bernauer Straße. They had walled up all the apartments and the people had been evicted, but the doorbells were working. And then you would get a Volkspolizist, yet another folk emanation, getting angry and shouting, so go away. They hadn't yet turned off the electricity of the bells. So the Cold War was very strongly visible. And so that put a particular burden on any idea of wanting to play with Marxian ideas, because there's always the joke that a dialect with an army is a language. And you could say that a Marxist with a country is a Stalinist, was the maxim that you could see in action. So how could one have a leftist position that was somewhat Marxian, for my generation, also Freudian without any doubt? There was enough of the Frankfurt School in it, somewhat activist. I went to these Ban the Bomb marches in Frankfurt. The only Frankfurt School representative you saw there was Habermas. Adorno never went to anything that had a particular political valence to it. So how can one make a critical theory also activist, even on a small scale of just signing a petition or going to a demonstration? And so the other side also that was in the air where Williams was important, whole culture, everyday culture, lived culture that includes also popular formations as a possibility. And there I think Adorno was so rigorous. His essays on jazz were absolute horror essays for students in my generation who went to jazz concerts all the time. And then, to have this "und ewig stampft die Jazzmaschine," these kinds of phrases. So how can one deal with popular cultural formations was a question. There's a wonderful anecdote of Brecht in the emigre circle in California. And Adorno has just performed a musical piece, and Brecht raises his hand and said, "Teddy, can you play that another time on the accordion?" And that would be like this is good for Daniel, because the way you play in a tartan with a clarinet or with a saxophone, blending different folk formations. That was absolutely horrifying, of course, for Ted. So yeah. The question of how can one have a somewhat leftist progressive perspective in view of the fact of what Stalinism was doing daily, and how can one be engaged in literary study, taking literary texts also really seriously as literature, and be concerned about historical formations, conceptual clarity, and all. For all of that, I think Williams was absolutely perfect. And the last thing of sort of that contextualization concerns the other directions that were, of course, in the air to trying to do similar things. And one thing I remembered now, just thinking about the conversation we might have, was Hans-Robert Jauss came to the Free University and gave a talk about, it wasn't yet called reception theory, but he started with a wish to bring together the rigor of the Russian formalists, creating a literary series, looking at a single genre's development across national boundaries, and at the same time, trying to do a social history of the institution of the novel. So that was for him a wish, how can that be brought together? And I think, again, there on that score, encountering Williams's work was important because he also dealt with that issue and dealt with it, as I said, clearly and in ways that that could, that you could. I remember talking with friends who were reading Williams, and there was a real excitement about doing that. That's why I say I love Williams, because there were so many things in it that you actually could love. Whereas in many other places, you saw a thing that really spoke to you, but it was an isolated thing here and there. He seemed to be so attractive on many scores. So I think that maybe I should just stop. It's a long monologue.
Well, let me just pick up a couple of the things you've said, Werner, because some of them are interestingly counter to some of the consensus perhaps in Britain. For instance, Raymond is often dismissed for, I think it's Terry Eagleton's phrase, conjuring weight out of absence. Whereas it's the particularity and the clarity of his writing that clearly appeal to you. And then from a British perspective, European Marxism is often admired for its sort of rigor and its stringency and the way it can identify things rather than the more woolly kind of humanist. Harald was talking about structures of feeling, the role of culture in E.P. Thompson and Williams, the sort of pre-scientific Marxism, which was then rejected by the new left, whereas your reading of Williams is quite different. I mean, you're clearly familiar with the Frankfurt School in a way that British Marxists generally weren't, but you find something in Williams that is filling a gap in the sort of German Marxist tradition. Yeah. I'm wondering then whether that takes you towards the thinking about questions of identity, of ethnicity, the direction your own work takes, aspects of intellectual thought or cultural experience that Raymond Williams is often accused of ignoring or being ignorant of. Is my synopsis accurate?
Yeah, no, I think the questions that you have, first of all, Williams also wrote so much and continued writing. So I think one could also easily pick different Williamses depending on where you go. Yeah, I was thinking, the first love is, of course, with culture and society and country in the city, but. He kept on writing, and every time you read an essay, there's always something I find interesting and also something that's well formulated. And I think he dealt with issues, even up to issues that now with whatever, is it really true that you have gasoline shortage, or is that European propaganda in the Venetian press that there is no more benzina in the gas stations in England thanks to Brexit?
Yeah, no, I think it's true.
Okay. Anyway, he had, I thought, wonderful quips about that too. That he wrote in this here, I find it ironic that some of the angriest opponents of Scottish and Welsh nationalism are also angry opponents of British membership in the European community, in which a wider unity is being sought. So the idea of accusing in one direction separatism and in the other direction unity, you know, so he looks at the parallel or the symmetry or an asymmetry between wishing to control something that's called whatever the UK. Also, I liked is making fun of it, anyway, spelling it UK.
Yeah.
I think that Paul Gilroy actually picked up in the kind of polemic against this new formation of UK nationalism. Claiming a broader universal speech if you're the dominant category in a place, and at the same time resisting fiercely a yet larger category into which you could also easily blend. I thought that was quite interesting. And I think in the work that you've collected, where he wrote about this, his Welshness, I think so carefully that is almost a model of saying, Phoebe this morning talked about the mongrel issue in the Stuart Hall reading of Raymond Williams. And I think the sense that he gives, it is impossible to live under the domination of someone else without changing and without also accommodating and be taking up things. And so claiming a pure Welshness free of all Englishness is a quixotic quest for him, and also a sort of self-annihilating quest. So how can one deal with that fact of being in a border country and therefore having, and I think that speaks so directly to the situation of ethnic minorities in the United States that I've been concerned with for some of my work, or also of the issue of mixed marriages and the question of, you know, as in my English family, the mother was Welsh, and so my exchange student was half Welsh and was very much aware that he wasn't fully fluent in the Welsh language anymore. His mother still was. So I mean, all these things that come along with it, and I think he was very keenly aware of that. So I think when he talks about, and I guess the hairy term for Gilroy and also for Stuart Hall was this sort of settled country, or, you know, kind of settled relationship. I think he just had a sense of where over time something had been worked out that included accommodation, becoming like the other, and at the same time having a wish, a continuous wish for self-determination that takes different shapes in different historical situations, which I think describes pretty much any quest for, you know, whether you call it independence or division. He also played with the two terms, you know, that in one person's eye, a divisiveness, in another person's eye is the quest for independence. So I think this makes him very perceptive in the relationship where he, you know, has received, I think, maybe not always just criticism as, you know, Phoebe mentioned this morning the double consciousness issue coming out of Du Bois, which I think is also something you could see in Williams, that he, you know, he doesn't become someone who says everything I will write about will be only about Wales because I'm Welsh, and you know, it's something that concerned him obviously and concerned him existentially, but in fact the majority of his work is about English, the English literary tradition, and so he very clearly looks at that with a kind of double consciousness that includes the Welsh perspective, though it doesn't always articulate itself up front, and is, as I said before, I think is methodologically sophisticated and at the same time so clear, so admirably clearly written that it's a pleasure to go back and, you know, look, just open 10, 12 pages of Raymond Williams, and you you just read them. You don't have the sense of, I don't know where this is going. Where's the, the glossary? What do I need as a prolegomena in order to approach this? I think that's a very great talent.
I think that's a wonderful summation, and yeah, I think that's very much my experience as well. I think it was in responding to Phoebe earlier, I kind of described my own attempt at reading Raymond Williams in the light of Werner Sollors, kind of backwards in a way, because I think that dimension of his thinking had not been addressed and was kind of being ignored. Not so much because the hybridity was being ignored, but that the Welshness itself was not acknowledged. So within a British frame, he just is that. But actually, the constituents of a Britishness that is simultaneously an Englishness and a Welshness is what he's always picking at. In terms of your own then interest in questions of ethnicity and American ethnicity, particularly, Werner, I wonder, is the source of that in a sense German, or is the source of that American? That is, you mentioned Adorno. There's a letter from Adorno, I think, to Horkheimer in the late 30s, where he says something along the lines of, everything we've been talking about in terms of class is in fact race. Suddenly the Jewish question becomes central in a way that it hadn't been a short period before. So that the question of ethnicity and identity is central maybe from fairly early on, or is it the case rather that an European sort of new left wasn't so concerned with those issues, but America and American popular culture that you were clearly attracted to as kind of alternative was, and that's what drew you in that direction, especially African American popular culture? Which is it either or is there a compatibility between those things?
Heide Fehrenbach wrote a book called Race After Hitler, in which she makes the argument that in post-war Germany, the identification with Black Americans became a substitute for not talking about the Holocaust. That I think was an argument. In my personal case, that is certainly not true. We had a high school teacher who spent an entire year, it was very unusual in my generation, on dealing with the Nazis and with the Holocaust. There wasn't yet a school book about that topic. So he made us buy a Fischer paper book by Walter Hofer, Der Nationalsozialismus in Dokumenten. And we went through that very carefully. And it was an unforgettable year in high school in social studies. So the not only the feeling that, growing up in post-war Germany, I always wondered, you see somebody with my kind of gray hair, say, what were they doing? But very specifically finding out what they had done in high school as part of the curriculum, gave you quite a different perspective before there was any taking high schools to, concentration camps or something, but we did that on our own. So I think that sense was very strong. But on the other hand, also, I will not deny that I grew up in the American zone. Black soldiers were always incredibly nice to children. So there was a kind of effective relationship that I developed early on with Black Americans, listening to the music, going to the, Allkamp Frankfurt had the Jazzkeller, and you could stay till 2 a.m. unless your parents didn't permit you to, which was the case for me. But after big jazz concerts, there were always big groups coming. They were just, improvising. And so that was a world that was very important. So all of that already happened in Germany, I think. But then once I started teaching, I taught the first class in ethnic literature at Columbia University, I'm proud to say, in 1975. It had never been done. And I had lots of students who came with exactly this kind of identitarian baggage. Not quite, they were running away from, they were at Columbia, they didn't want to be in the Greek neighborhood and all the rest. And at the same time, they were uneasy about, am I really this and that? So I became fascinated by the pervasiveness of this thing. And I think there's also, again, something to Williams's question about America not yet being so fully settled. So the whole thing is out there and very raw out there. In Germany, there was the big refugee issue after the war, of course. You know, you have 12 or 14 million people getting expelled, general housing shortage, and then getting integrated in areas where there were completely different dialects and completely different histories was actually an amazing task accomplished in a very short time, but it's a task that also took a toll on identity formation, but it was still within at least the same name of the same country, or well, maybe it's changed the name too, but you know, a similar formation you could feel. But the idea of being second or third generation migrant, or the students who wrote me, you know, response paper was saying, I'm really nothing. I have, you know, parents and grandparents from 6 different countries. I don't know how to define myself. You know, can I even take a course on ethnic literature because I'm nothing? So these identity issues seem to become more and more pressing. So that I also became interested, which must have been a Williamson effect of saying, how did the term identity come about at all? You know, what was it? I was surprised to find that it was only Erik Erikson in 1948 who launched it in the sense of not the identity of the suspect was known to the police. You know, a single man has an identity, and that identity is recognizable, but to say, I have an identity as X, and I know I share this identity with 12 million other X's, or something of that nature, that's only in childhood and society, and used it in order to describe the way Freud felt as a Jew, because he said he was asked to give a talk at the B'nai Brit and to define his Jewishness, and he said, well, you know, I'm not religious. I certainly don't believe in race as you know, a scientific concept. So it is something like you know, an unfathomable feeling of having something in common with others that I can't quite put my finger on it. The secret sameness, the heimliche Identität, that's where the term came up. And that Erikson foreshortened and made identity out of it in that sense. So I feel I have something mysterious in common. I can't put my finger. It's not religion. It's not race. And so all of a sudden, this term really took in discussions of social belonging. So I have an identity. I don't have an identity. I have an identity as X. And my favorite identity quip that I often have given students is when Kafka was asked the same question as Freud was asked, and Kafka said, what do I have in common with the Jews? I don't even have anything in common with myself. Thank God that I can breathe alone. You know, that was the answer that he had. So which way, it puts a little bit of a higher, makes a higher demand on the term identity that otherwise we use very easily. So I don't know, I think the foundation of that was laid in Germany. I was just thinking when Hald was speaking, I heard Reginald Rudolph, who was an East German refugee to West Germany and who became a specialist in jazz. And he had organized Negro concerts in Protestant churches in East Germany, because you couldn't have a jazz concert, but you could have eine Negermesse. And so they would have Negro masses, and then they would have jazz bands playing, and that worked. And he argued that musical anthems were actually completely neutral, and that jazz did not have any inherently you know, liberating quality in it, that was all an external. And his example was, there was a Prussian march called Alte Kameraden, which was considered so inherently militaristic that it was banned both after World War I and after World War II in Germany. But that same march was mistranslated into Finnish as Old Cameramen and became the song of the amateur photographers in a neutral country, Finland. So that was an example that music travels in the most mysterious ways, and what for one group means I have to stand up and march, for another group means, is my shutter speed correct? Or, did I leave my photograph too long in the liquid and now it will be the wrong color? So I think that was a good example for someone who himself had played a camouflage game with the East German authorities to get the black music in. And along with the black music, that's something I haven't mentioned at all. The big thing for my generational moment was, of course, you had Hitler and Stalin both loathed modernist art and literature. That, I mean, it's something they really shared. So banning jazz on the one hand, as for the Nazis, Negroid, and for the communists, it was too commercial and bourgeois or whatnot. Yeah. And modernist literature was something you couldn't deal with. So therefore, we loved modernism. That was, I think, the thing. So you go with your aunt to an art gallery, you see, of course, Jackson Pollock is great art. She said, well, I can do that. And you have to sort of play the modernist tune because the Nazis and the communists both had opposed it. And that was still so strong. In 1963, Eduard Goldstücker, who was another big person for me, did a Kafka conference in a villa near Prague. And Kafka was banned in East Germany and in Czechoslovakia. And it was banned for the reasons that alienation was not a theme that was of any interest to socialist countries. And so the whole question was, is it possible to be alienated in socialist countries? And of course, every conference, but is it ever possible? You just live, of course, it's full of alienation. And Kafka is great reading exactly for situations like we are in. So that seemed like a confirmation of this whole, how modernist ferment was inherently anti-totalitarian and was something that would give you another leg to stand on in rejecting the fascist past and the Stalinist present.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. It resonates somewhat with Raymond Williams himself, much earlier in the late 30s, early 40s in Cambridge. But he writes quite powerfully that it's Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses that is the literature that he and his fellow sort of leftists are espousing and enjoying. And some of that comes through then later in Country and the City, where he writes about Joyce very powerfully. But yeah, he doesn't have too much to say about Kafka. But as you say, Raymond wrote so much, probably I could go and find some material now on him writing a little bit on Kafka. Well, I mean, we were in Columbia at the beginning of that answer, Werner, delivering the first ethnic studies course, as you say, and then becoming very much associated with African-American literature and the exploration of African-American literature. I mean, from what you're describing, the use of African-American culture as a crucible in which various European identities define themselves, I mean, is particularly interesting, isn't it, in the Second World War period? I was always shocked to discover Josef Svorecky, the Czech author, describing his dislike of Paul Robeson, that Robeson was forced upon them by the Soviet authorities as a genuine kind of authentic, Volkish, if you like, African-American, in a context where Duke Ellington and Count Basie and so forth were banned, which is what Svorecky wanted to listen to. Whereas in Wales, Robeson is the great socialist hero who identified with the miners, So the reception of African-American culture reflects things about European cultures in different ways, and presumably informs your own work then on African-American literature.
Svorecky has that wonderful essay about red music, which he didn't use as a title for the communist allusion, but just he thought everybody had said blue music and he wanted another color, but he was writing about jazz. And Paul Robeson, of course, had written the entry in the great Stalinist Soviet encyclopedia on jazz, denouncing it. So that, he was a little bit more implicated in there. That wasn't just, made up by Sollors. And he was held up too by the commissars as the good Black music, because and although the religious thing was already a little dicey, but the work songs, and especially when he sings like Chinese songs and Russian songs, that was really good. Whereas the jazz was banned. That was a very paradoxical situation, of course. Yeah, you're right. This is a wonderful example of the heroism in Wales for Paul Robeson, and that thing again, Phoebe mentioning the Du Bois. Du Bois too is in that same predicament, because he gets the Lenin Prize, and his autobiography, the first 5 chapters are Stalinist tract on, thank God the people of Czechoslovakia have freed themselves with the Red Army, and all that stuff. But the bourgeois Western societies are linked behind, and so forth, so that all the perceptiveness that Du Bois had was reduced. Although I think hear more and more, I had suspicion of that when I edited the book recently, that Du Bois actually didn't want these 5 chapters at the beginning. When you open the autobiography, I want to know what Du Bois left. For 5 chapters, you have to get a treatment about how great the Soviet Union has been treating Eastern Europe after World War II. It's a very strange affair to get, but apparently that was the editor who put that first, and since it was published posthumously, Du Bois didn't have an influence. Somebody should really dig into that a little more. But certainly, heroic figures who were really perceptive, and double consciousness is such a great term, whether it comes from Goethe or from Hegel or whatnot. Du Bois really makes it speak to that situation. That is also exactly the situation that Daniel highlighted about the Welshness issue for Raymond Williams. And then that same man can write a terrible political tract as a preface to his autobiography. It's very strange. And the post-war period certainly had lots of these stories of people going this way and that way.
Yeah, I'm seeing we're kind of running out of time. Let me ask a question of a slightly theoretical nature, Werner, which I quite like to hear your views on. It was you who introduced me to the work of Walter Ben Michaels, I remember, especially Our America, the study of modernism. So it links to that. But one of Michaels's major arguments in recent times, if I can offer a summary that makes sense, is that he warns us of the danger of making class an identity. So he argues that the contemporary emphasis on identity is a disaster for the left. And the argument goes something like this, that a class-based politics is involved with the eradication of that which you're fighting for. Ultimately an equal society so that classes cease to exist. Whereas an identitarian politics is about the sustaining and preservation of an identity. So to make class an identity is a huge category mistake, and is ultimately reactionary, because what you're doing is pickling or preserving an unjust social system. And in an interview with Ben Michaels, he says quite explicitly that he thinks the root of this tendency to think of class as an identity is to be found in the works of Raymond Williams and the beginnings of British cultural study. He says all this nostalgia about his working class upbringing. You talked about Erikson and the concept of identity, and then there's then today the whole debate about identitarianism. Where do you think we stand now? I mean, are we in a world of pure pluralism, to use your case, which you were arguing against, where everyone's in their silos, unable to debate with one another? Or are there signs, are there resources of hope, as Raymond Williams might call them, to be found elsewhere?
Well, I mean, Walter Ben Michaels has started out questioning the notions of race. First that in America you can speak only if you are already what you're describing. That was his argument. So it's not something you can become, and that would be in the early work of Ben Michaels an inherent difference to class, because class consciousness is something you can acquire, even as most of the leftist heroes did not, like Williams, grow up in a working class environment, but became working class oriented, although they came very often from mostly petty bourgeois and sometimes also grand bourgeois background. So you can acquire a class perspective. But it is true that the harshness of identitarianism may now also affect class, which I think in the Williams world, of course, carried the way that it actually united people in another way. Of course, you belong to a class, so you work for a railway company in that case, and so you're part of a village, but because of the railway, you're also part of another system. This is the way Williams argues out his personal situation by showing their different forms of belongingness. So I think with class, inherently, the danger is a less serious one, because it's a more mobile category. I mean, the East German constitution had included that everyone who was a member of the Communist Party is therefore inherently working class, and his children should have all the benefits of free education and so forth that every worker has. So it's a perfect example of class belonging you can create by fiat. Ethnic belonging is a little bit harder to create by fiat, especially when it's so insisted upon in the way exactly that Williams was against, by saying, I'm only X, and don't speak to me about that. You tell a Polish joke and the person says, don't tell me that joke, I'm Polish. And then the person says, okay, I'll tell it slowly, right? It's a joke, but now it's no longer a joke. You probably can't even tell it. And you probably have to erase this part of the recording because it is so inherently offensive, because it touches on immutable deep identities. I think class jokes are always much easier to go. A parvenu is a constant joke theme, whereas somebody who is a racial passer who pretends to be white but really has some black ancestry is always a tragic or a serious topic. Whereas the parvenu is a wonderful comedy topic, somebody who through manners all of a sudden reveals there is a background and it becomes a joke. So I think the class issue is aristocracies ruled that they were themselves hereditary and other groups were different classes. But that's a thing of the past now, except in the royal family, I guess, and even there, intermarriage. Oh, we're not going to go there. But for the issue of, and what we were talking about is the working class is what of course Ben Michaels is concerned with. Seems to be more a much more pliable category, and also for Williams, that's always the possibility of emerging something coming out on the other side that will, so there is a hopefulness that can attach itself to that category. It's not a category that is a residual one, it's an emergent one that needs to be given a new shape in which the different identities can flow in. Whereas the hardcore ethnic identitarianism insists on permanent boundaries, immutable situations, legacies of the past that can never be overcome, and so forth. I think that is the problem of, well, your generation, no longer my generation, but I think that is a change, a real change in the world, from Erik Erikson thinking of identity to an identitarianism setting into in such a full blast way. That is a new situation.
I guess it's that emphasis on openness and potential development that's the key there. You know, that's kind of central, I think. Well, in my reading of your work, a central emphasis of your work and of Raymond Williams is the question then is then how far do you go before the identity disappears, right, in a process of assimilation potentially. So at the same time that there's the emphasis on the particular, and in thinking of this, I tend to think that Raymond Williams's attack on the idea of center and periphery of country and the city has something to do with the internal diversity of any community or of any group. And the role, therefore, is not actually to emphasize some kind of inherent closed purity, but rather to emphasize the diversity within that group. I remember being struck by a section of Beyond Ethnicity where you talk about melting pots within melting pots. You know, there's almost like a Chinese boxes effect where you can keep creating pots, but perhaps that is the goal in a sense, because the pot then allows for a diversity of identities to coexist. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the internal diversity of groups that are believed to be held together by singular modes is something to keep in mind. At the same time, there may be single events, deep down in a group that can come. I just reviewed an autobiography by an Armenian American scholar. He ran away from his background and became a historian of Japan. And he said the advantage was I learned Japanese and I could work easily about 18th century Japan because there were lots of sources. But about Armenia, I only had some hearsay. I know Armenian, I spoke it at home, but they never said anything about the past. He had parents who had a lacuna about the entire background. So he had to learn about the Armenian genocide and why his grandparents had emigrated at all, much later in life, but he had run away. Now he wrote an autobiography, and he basically said the thing I did not know defined my life nonetheless. I had a wonderful book, but it shows you that something even that's not said can have the power of all of a sudden reminding you of being part of a collectivity that you for much of your life didn't feel. When you were at the University of Chicago as a professor of Japanese, that wasn't his world. And then thinking about it late in life, I think he's in his 90s now, came back a whole thing of that was something that was also my world. And writing almost a harsh indictment also of the poor parents, but also of the social situation they found themselves in, that they felt they had to deny, they couldn't pass this on. That was a terrible legacy to pass on. So it's, I think, so something harrowing can come up that all of a sudden rallies you to a sense of a temporary group identity that has a lot of, sentiment, deep structure of sentiment to it, but you didn't know you had it. I think that's what struck me about that book.
Yes, that's a striking notion, isn't it? That discovery, yeah. Sorry.
Harry Harutunen is his name. I forgot.
Yes, I remember reading your review of that. Well, I think time is beating us. I feel I've given you a good grilling, Werner, and thank you very much for your very full responses too. Are you happy to take some questions from the floor if there are some pressing questions? I see that Marian here from China is just commenting to thank you very much for the precious sharing. I don't know if you can see these quotes as well. You said in the beginning that Raymond Williams's writing was clear in meaning. I wonder why you made such a judgment. My impression of Marxism and literature, as well as his fiction, is that he's quite evasive and obscure. Well, we did discuss that a bit. Or do you mean that Williams has a clear standpoint? But I think you were suggesting that he's clear in terms of his articulation of the standpoint, in addition to the particular standpoint that he's writing from.
But I think I mean, you could summarize the major critical books. That's what I was talking about. Not everything that he wrote, and there's a clear argument in it, and it's clearly presented. I think that.
Yeah, even with Marxism and literature, the Welsh historian Gwyn Williams said, you know, it's an unreadable book. And I was thinking, well, has he tried Adorno's aesthetic theory? These things tend to be comparative, I think. Any other questions or questions from our panelists? Phoebe, there are a number of threads in Werner's talk that resonate with what you were talking about this morning.
Yeah, very much so. I don't know if it's left me with questions so much as just kind of trying to take it all in. It's very interesting to hear your path towards, you know, the area of study that you ended up in and how that resonates with what you were talking about in a way with the book you just reviewed. It seems to me sitting here that in some way or other, we're all trying to work out our own formation a lot of the time, even if we're not conscious of doing it.
Well, maybe we'll meet in the Barker Center some other time.
Yeah.
Yeah, to talk it over, absolutely. Well, there's no resolving these questions, but I think your own testimony today, Werner, indicates that Raymond Williams is one of those thinkers who still speaks to us today. At the beginning, I was just talking of the ways in which we deal with intellectual history, and some intellectuals seem to belong specifically to their period. They address the moment in which they speak and seem to be, in some ways, it's harder to resuscitate them or to make use of them in our contemporary moment. And Raymond Williams, it struck me in the 90s, was being discussed in those terms as a sort of pre-end of communism socialist. Cornel West's description of him, the last male revolutionary intellectual in the age of Europe, you know, a particular kind of placing. But it strikes me during the centenary year, events taking place across the world, that people are still making use. He's still an enabling thinker, to use an overused term, but I think perhaps it's relevant to Raymond Williams. Your testimony regarding him today, I think, reflects that. So let me just thank you very, very much for joining us.
I have to thank you for inviting me and thank the other panelists for giving such good papers.